Okay, thank you for joining us back. What a fantastic day we've had together and sharing all our knowledge and networks. And now we're very privileged, I think, to have one of the most influential voices on loneliness and on public health with us today, Dr. Vivek Murthy, who's really been very important in this field and has worked for many, many years in the medical field and in public health, but also was the 19th Surgeon General in the United States. So we're very, very privileged to have him here. And also joining us, thank you so much, Jenny. Jenny Anderson, who is from Quartz, but has been a journalist on the New York Times for over 10 years and worked and thought and written a lot about this area as well. So over to you. Thank you, you both.
Thank you so much. It's always tough being at the end of the day, but I am fully convinced after having spent some time with Dr. Murthy that well worth your while staying. I'm hoping that you get just a bit of this from him. I want to start with your story. We usually associate the Surgeon General with obesity and smoking and HIV, and you use the bully pulpit to talk about loneliness. Why? What got you there?
Well, I'll just say, first of all, it's just a joy to be here, and what an honor and privilege to be here supporting an organization that I've admired from the outside for a long time, but to be with a group of people who are so passionate about the subject and with such a thoughtful and respected journalist. You know, my journey to working on loneliness was certainly not an expected one or planned one for me. When I went through my confirmation hearing to serve as Surgeon General, they asked me what my priorities would be. And I did not list loneliness in that priority list because it wasn't one at the time. But I was really taught about this subject by people all across the country in the United States who, when I would visit their communities, would tell me stories of their struggles with addiction, with violence, with chronic illnesses like obesity, with mental illness, depression and anxiety. But what was often unsaid were these stories of loneliness, which would take some time to dig out. No one ever came to me and said, hello, my name is John Q, I'm lonely. What they said is, you know, I've been struggling with this illness, or my family is struggling with this problem, and when I would dig a little bit, it would come out. And I started to then surface the topic more deliberately, and I started to ask people about loneliness. And what I found was after an initial pause, the stories would come out, and everyone had a story to share, whether it was about themselves or about someone else. I remember one talk I was giving in particular, and I just happened to, as part of a 1-hour discussion, I spent probably 2 minutes just mentioning loneliness, but it's all people wanted to talk about at the end, because it was just so deep an experience, such a common experience. But the truth is that my experience with loneliness didn't start when I was in office. It started long before that, when I was a child, actually. I was blessed to be brought up by 2 wonderful parents and a wonderful sister. My parents actually lived here in England for 7 years. This is where I was born. Not here in London, but up north in Yorkshire County in Huddersfield. I was told that people would laugh at me if I said that. And there it is. But you know, they were wonderful parents, and I had a great sister, and I never felt lonely or challenged emotionally at home. But school was a different matter, because I was very shy as a kid, and while I loved spending time with other friends and with other kids, I had a hard time actually initiating conversation and breaking through. And I had dealt with some issues around racism and such when I was younger, and some of that was often weighing on me when I was, and sort of impacted my self-confidence. And so as a result, school was a challenging experience, not academically, but socially. And when I would pull up to school in the mornings when my parents would drop me off, I would feel that pit in my stomach that you often feel on the first day of classes or before a big exam, but it wasn't about exams, and it wasn't the first day of class. It was about worrying about being lonely. And to this day, I've never told my parents that I was lonely as a child. And I didn't tell them because I was ashamed at the time. Saying that I was lonely felt like saying I wasn't worthy of being loved. And no one wants to feel that. And so, my experience with loneliness started long before that. And when I look back on it in retrospect, I realized that I was seeing it even during my clinical practice when I was taking care of patients. One of the first things, in fact, that struck me when I entered the hospital as a medical intern during my first year of residency was this interesting disparity. And it was as follows. Some patients I found, when they came in and they were hospitalized, would have family come by and visit, and friends come by, and some people spend the night. And other patients would have no one. And even if it was a holiday like Christmas or Thanksgiving, there was no one around. Even if they were going through a severe bout of illness and had to make an incredibly important decision about whether they would be open to getting intubated and put on a ventilator if they needed it, there was nobody for them to make that decision with. And that really stuck with me. And it was just kept cropping up again and again. Some patients seem to have no one. I'll tell you one last anecdote on this, which is a patient who I met like early on in my training in clinic, actually. He wasn't in the hospital, but I saw him as an outpatient. And he was a middle-aged man in his early 60s, and he looked for all the world just like any other a guy off the street. But when I walked into his room, the first thing he said to me is he said, the worst thing that ever happened to me is I won the lottery. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, I actually literally played the lottery and I won. And I get this check now for $300,000 every year, and I'll be getting that for the next 20 years. But it was the worst thing that ever happened to me. So I asked him to tell me more, and slowly his story unraveled. He was a chef at a well-known hotel in Boston, Massachusetts. And he had a great job. He had a great clientele. People loved his food. He liked the people he worked with. He lived in a small, modest home in the city. And he had a good life. But when he won the lottery, he did what most people would do, which is to say, why do I have to work again? I've got plenty of money. So he quit his job. And he thought, why do I need to live in this small home? He moved out to a fairly wealthy oceanside community in Hull, Massachusetts, where he bought a big house. And he thought, I've got it. I've made it. This is the life. But he said shortly after that, he realized that all of the houses had big fences around them, and people were actually separated from each other. No one really talked to each other anymore. And in fact, it said that his neighbors were all rich snobs, which was a whole other issue, but that was there. And then he missed his colleagues at work. He missed the clients who appreciated his food and made him feel valued. Soon after that, he developed high blood pressure, he developed diabetes, and ended up in the clinic seeing me for management of those two things. And I reflected on that when I was in office, and I just realized that loneliness has been there under my nose the whole time as well, present in my life and the people around me, but it's taken me a while to fully recognize that.
And so maybe the world is also tracking alongside you because, the campaign to End Loneliness has been around for 10 years. And as we noted all day today, it seems to be having a moment. A lot of people are paying attention to it. People like myself are writing about it. What's happened in the world? I mean, you've taken us through your personal journey, but what's happened in the world that suddenly we are actually focused on loneliness?
I don't 100% know, but I think part of what's happening is, I think there's a bit of a snowballing effect that's happening with the more we talk about it, the more people feel like they have permission to share and to talk about it, and I think a bit of that snowball is building. I think the second thing that's happening is there actually is more research on this topic now, thanks to Julianne, who we heard from earlier today, and others who have been studying the field now and putting out more research on it. I think there's a third piece as well that's weighing in here, or a third and fourth piece. The third being that this is a very common experience, and it's not new. People have been lonely for hundreds of years. But I think the fact that it is an almost universal experience, that at some point in their lives people have felt lonely, makes it easier for people to be open to thinking about it, even if they don't want to talk about it. But finally, I think there are a number of intractable challenges that we're dealing with right now, in health and outside of health. On the health front, when I was in office, I was working on the opioid epidemic. I was working on addiction more broadly. These are just on violence. They're just a few of a series of difficult challenges we have. And I think some of these seemingly intractable problems, which seem resistant to our simple solutions, have pushed people to ask the question, is there something deeper happening here? Is there something deeper contributing to depression? Why are so many children on medication for attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder? Like, why is addiction such an issue now? And so I think there's an openness to think a little bit more about what might be happening under the surface. And I think our connections with each other fraying is actually one of those important elements.
I want to push back a little bit and sort of take the critic's point of view. So if you're sitting at a table with the president, as perhaps you have done in the past, many of us haven't, And people are making their case for what they want public taxpayer money spent on. Critics would say social isolation is not rising. There is no loneliness epidemic. There have always been lonely people, and there's such a wide range, and we can't even measure it accurately, 10 to 50%. And some people like Eric Klinenberg, who's a big proponent of social cohesion, would also say, be careful. If we focus too much on loneliness, we're taking away from necessary solving other problems, bigger problems like poverty, like social housing. I'd love you to address the critics and say, convince me why they're wrong.
Yeah, so I think these are actually important questions to ask, because I think we have to be judicious about where we put our time, attention, and resources. And there are some legitimate criticisms here. We don't have nearly as much data in terms of quality or quantity on loneliness as we have, let's say, on diabetes or heart disease. And that's partly because we haven't invested the resources in understanding this issue as deeply as we have the other issues. But what I would say, and the other thing is, it is also not clear that loneliness is rising at a dramatically high rate. That it's not going from a prevalence of 1% to 50% in a matter of a couple of years. That's not happening. But what is true, and even though there's variation in studies, what is true is that there are millions and millions of people in the United States, millions of people in Europe and in other parts of the world who are in fact struggling with loneliness. There is no study of loneliness that has come out and said, no, this isn't an issue, like in our population. It's prevalent, it's common. And the studies that Julianne and others have done have also shown a robust association with illnesses that we actually care about, including heart disease, dementia, depression, and anxiety, and very importantly, longevity. And so what I would say is that if you're thinking, how do I divvy up the pie between breast cancer research and heart disease research and diabetes? How do I think about other social issues like poverty? What I would say is that our connection with each other is very much interwoven into those problems. We cannot, I say this as somebody who spent nearly his entire tenure working on the addiction crisis in America, we will not solve the addiction problem in America if we don't address social connection. And so if we recognize that, then it becomes part of the solution that we have to invest in, not an alternative to working on addiction. And that's part of the connection that we are trying to make for the public in the United States as well, is to see that this is not a separate siloed health issue. This is deeply connected to these other health issues as well, and has to be part of how we address them.
Right, which raises an interesting question of whether it's better tackled with a minister of loneliness, sort of a vertical, or whether you try to infuse it across departments. But that's a whole different kettle of fish. That could take us down a rabbit hole from which we never recovered. So I was speaking with Julianne, and one of the interesting challenges here is the evidence for what works is also mixed, not very robust, in part because there hasn't been the investment. So what do we do? Where do you see the greatest hope as to what the action plan as to what we do to go forward?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I think every field has sort of had this challenge at some point, right? Like, you got to start somewhere. There's going to be a lack of evidence. There's going to be a lack of proof of what programs work, certainly at scale, and there's going to be a lack of know-how as well. Like, if you were to say who can provide the technical assistance for how to scale loneliness programs, like in large companies, nobody has the golden key to that solution set. But we have to start somewhere, and I think there is, in fact, though, enough data to tell us or to give us some clues as to where we can start. So, for example, if you are interested in schools, for example, and thinking about how we can start to address loneliness in schools, there are programs that have some evidence behind them that I think are starting points. Like we have in the United States, in Chicago, which is in the state of Illinois in the Midwest in the US, is a city that's been in the news a lot because of violence over the years, some of that unfairly so, but they have do have a high rate of violence. And they had a program they implemented a few years ago called the Becoming a Man program. Is anyone familiar with that program? Has anyone heard of it? Wonderful. This was a very interesting program that was started by a man who himself grew up in the sort of tough neighborhoods of Chicago. And he created a program that took young at-risk men in high school and brought them together in small groups with a mentor who would facilitate conversation once a week among these young boys. And that's what they did. And they did that over the course of a year, over the course of about 30 or 32 weeks. And it wasn't as simple as just throwing a facilitator and a group of young men together. These facilitators had to go through a lot of training in how to open up a forum for discussion, how to deal with anger when it arose from one of the young men, and with how to be comfortable with silence, which is a really important part of discussion, but which we often gloss over. And over the course of the 30 or so weeks, there was this transformation that happened among these young men. And when this program was studied actually as a controlled trial by the University of Chicago with control schools and experimental schools, they found in 1 year there was a 44% reduction in violent arrests in the schools that had the Becoming a Man program. And these results have actually held up. It's being expanded now to other schools, both in Chicago and now increasingly in Boston. But when I spoke to the founder of that program and I said, what do you think the sort of active ingredient is here? Like, what's making the difference?
The secret sauce.
Yeah. And because some people had assumed when they were writing about it that these kids must be learning about concrete strategies that they can use for how to sort of ramp down conflict, for how to de-escalate, for how to manage challenges when they arose, how to deal with their own anger. He said, nah. He's like, it's none of that. He's like, what our program did is it addressed loneliness in these kids. It gave them trusted relationships that they didn't otherwise have. And that became a source of healing for the pain that they were already experiencing, pain that was being expressed in the form of violence, verbal violence in terms of physical violence, pain that was getting into trouble ultimately with the law. But that's what the solution was. Now that's a fairly high quality study that the University of Chicago did that gives us a template for what we can do, not just in schools, frankly, but I think in communities more broadly. But the lesson there, I think the key lesson was that there are many people in the world who live lives without the kind of trusted connections that these young men built. And over time, what he told me is that these young men, when bad things would happen to them that would make them want to pull out a gun and use it on someone, or make them want to throw a fist at someone, they would pause and say, hold on, I got to take this to my group, and we got to figure this out. And then they would talk to the group about it. So yes, we don't have the robust body of evidence that we have for how you would treat diabetes or hypertension. But we have programs like the Becoming a Man program, which tell us that by building these trusted connections with people, we can have a significant impact on outcomes that actually matter.
Let me ask about government, because so we've talked about schools, and I do want to get to workplaces as well, because I think you mentioned something earlier that I think this group might appreciate. But you've been in the belly of the beast. So
Which
I guess
piece would that be? Many have been in the belly of.
the U.S. government.
Oh yes, that piece. Okay.
I'm not naming names. I actually mean more the bureaucracy than I do the president. Though I have my thoughts on that as well. I guess two questions. Do we want the government involved in social connections? And what is the biggest obstacle that you saw inside government to convincing people to make it a priority, if you think it should be?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the reaction from my colleagues in government was very interesting, which is that, first of all, nobody disagreed with this being an important issue.
Right.
And I think the reason actually was visceral. It wasn't because they went through some recent process. I think it's because, again, many of them had had experiences of loneliness too. There was a challenge about where does this fit in our agenda. And part of the work that we had to do was to convince people that this wasn't separate, but that this was part of the other big challenges that we were trying to face. And that was an effort, because that's not how most people had learned about addiction or about violence or many of the other public health challenges that we were dealing with. But I do think it's important to do that work in government, because I actually do believe there's an important role for government to play when it comes to addressing loneliness. I don't say that to mean that government should be the solution to loneliness. I actually think that government is likely to be a minority player, and that the majority of the solution will come from outside government. But here's actually where I think government is necessary. Number one, government can help us fund the research that we need to understand more about who loneliness is affecting, how it's manifesting, and how to address it, both prevent it and also address it when it arises. That is, sure, private foundations can contribute and help to support that, but in the United States at least, the lion's share of research funding comes from the National Institutes of Health. As generous as foundations have been, the government has the ability to really move the needle on research. The second thing the government can do is to lay out comprehensive strategies for how we can address an issue. The government has done this on various other issues, like over time, on HIV, on you name it, like the government in the United States and UK and other governments have done that. That's actually a very important function. The third thing, though, the governments can do is they can convene. They can bring the right players together to take action to execute on that strategy. They're not the only ones that can convene. I mean, here in the UK, the Campaign to End Loneliness has actually been a wonderful convener. But there's something powerful that happens when government takes it upon itself to convene. I mean, when Tracy Crouch was appointed to be the minister who would oversee the efforts on loneliness from the central government, that sent ripple effects all over the world. My team, we received many press calls from the media wanting to know what we thought about the UK appointing a minister and why this wasn't being done in the United States. It means something when the government chooses to make something a priority and reflects that at the highest level. So that's why I believe that the government has an important role to play in addressing this issue.
And how close are we in the U.S. to making, I mean, we in the UK, we're doing it. I mean, the U.S. is another market, but do we have the leadership around the world in the United States to do that? And what is the role of leadership itself?
I think we're still a ways away from having that in the government in the United States, because I think, you know, I'm not part of the Trump administration, but...
Anymore.
Well, I was primarily part of the Obama administration, then I carried over into the first 4 months of the Trump administration. But I will say that, so I'm not privy to the conversations that are happening within the administration around loneliness. But I think that, but even if we were still back in the Obama administration, I still think that we would have a bit of a ways to go. Because the truth is, like, people have more and have to recognize, again, how connected this is to everything else, and then they have to figure out how to prioritize it. So the UK has figured out one way to prioritize it, but that could look like many different things, like in the United States. It could look like, for example, asking a cabinet secretary, which would be they're like the Secretary of Health and Human Services, to take this on as an issue within his or her department. It could look like setting up a White House commission to focus on this issue that would coordinate among all the other departments. It could look like the National Prevention Council, which we were talking about a little earlier, but which is a council that I chaired when I was Surgeon General, which was a council that brought together the secretaries of all of the major federal agencies around an effort to infuse prevention planning into the policies that transportation and housing, urban and development, and defense and education all were implementing. And so that piece would have to be figured out as well. But the last thing I think is worth keeping in mind here is that for the government to make, and I'll speak for the US, although I suspect this is true for others as well, for the government to make a major move that would be sort of somewhat counterintuitive or counter to tradition at least, like appointing a major senior official to head up an effort to address loneliness, they would also need to know or like to know that there was public support for that. Because the last thing that they want to do is to be bashed on the head and saying, why are you wasting public dollars on this effort when we have people who are dying from opiate overdoses and who are still dying from breast cancer and who are still dying from a whole host of other conditions? So they would need to know that there's at least a basic amount of public buy-in to get started. And that's where I think, that's where some of my efforts and my team's efforts now are focused, is on trying to see how can we build public awareness around issues like loneliness and more broadly around emotional well-being, so that people understand what this is, how common it is, how consequential it is, and how it's connected to the other big issues that we're reading about in the paper. If we build that public support, I actually believe it will be much easier to push the government to take bold and decisive action.
I'm sort of toggling between sort of local, global, individual. What's the role we have? I mean, kind of take us through the sort of different actors who need to play a role in this building awareness. I was struck earlier today by this, it reminded me of the lean in movement, that a lot of this is on us. We need to get, we need to get out of our houses. We have a personal responsibility to make ourselves better connected. So we play a role, government plays a role, schools play a role. Of those actors, who's the easiest one to get to?
I mean, who's the easiest one to sort of take charge? Or?
To convince, to change. I guess really what we're talking about here is changing behavior. So if you look at like the anti-smoking campaign, very successful. Obesity and exercise have been less successful, less behavior change to do something rather than stop something can be very hard. We're trying to get people, governments, schools, businesses to recognize this as an issue. Which of those are the easiest actors? Which are the hardest?
Well, I think some of this is going to differ based on country, but I think that to go to the smoking example that you brought up, the modern day smoking movement in the United States, or anti-smoking movement, I should say, began in the 1960s. So in 1964, one of my predecessors, Surgeon General Luther Terry, published the country's first Surgeon General report on tobacco and the harms of smoking. It was actually the first ever Surgeon General's report, as it turns out. And there's a sort of funny story about this that you may know as a journalist, but that I learned recently, which is that when Luther Terry put out this seminal report, which actually reverberated all over, not just the United States, but around the world, it turned out on the way to the press conference to announce this, he was preparing with his notes in the back of his car, and he was actually smoking. And his assistant who was with him said to him, Dr. Terry, I just want to prepare you. The press may ask you the question, do you smoke? And he said, no, they wouldn't do something like that. They wouldn't ask such a personal question at a conference. And you could, obviously, that
we would never do that.
Yeah, no. Never do that, right? And so the assistant said, okay, that's fine. And so he went to the press conference. He did an amazing job. He put out the content of that report. He knew it was going to really anger people, especially in the tobacco industry. He did it and did a great job. And then he opened it up for questions. Reporter raises his hand. The first question is, Dr. Terry, do you smoke? And he said, no, I don't. And this reporter had actually done his homework, and he knew that Luther Terry smoked. And so he, in a somewhat cheeky way, said, so when did you quit? And Luther Terry responded, 30 minutes ago. But the way that Luther Terry's report had such a big impact was not entirely because of the report itself. It's because of what communities did after that report came out. It's because they took it upon themselves to build campaigns to educate young people about the dangers of smoking, because they fought on local school boards to get rules passed to bar smoking in schools or near schools. It's because movements decades later pushed for greater smoking-free initially, and then tobacco-free spaces, and universities started going tobacco-free. It's because the arm of the law was used as well, and lawsuits were filed and won against big tobacco, and a master settlement agreement was put in place in the United States, which provided tremendous amount of money for anti-smoking efforts. But all of this happened because multiple actors came together. And I think at this point, we could, like in the United States, for example, I think one of the places we need to start and start early is actually in schools when it comes to addressing loneliness. But that's not easy, because schools aren't under the thumb of the federal government. There's a lot of local control of schools. And so that's a fight that has to go school board to school board to school board. That's really challenging. I think businesses are interesting. We've had a lot of conversations with large companies that are worried about emotional well-being in their workplace, recognizing the productivity costs it has for them and the retention costs that it has when people are not doing well in terms of their mental health. And so I think there's a lot of receptiveness right now from companies to want to do something. The question is what? And that's what they always ask. Like, well, where should we start? Should we have support groups? Should we set up a hotline that people can call? Should we hire counselors? Like, where should we start? And this is where sometimes we are challenged with an evidence base. But I think what we can do is we can, at the very least, start by studying what we're doing right now. There are many companies, and I was just talking to a few, to Prudential and to Lockheed Martin and to the Bank of America, which are all building and have built, in fact, wellness programs for their employees that they're running, focused on physical wellness and mental wellness. But the question is, can we partner with them to actually help them study those programs so they know what works and what doesn't work? I'll lastly say that I think on this point, we can't underestimate the role that individuals have in addressing this gap that we have around loneliness. Because unlike many other illnesses, like diabetes or heart disease, where you need perhaps some medical skills to figure out how to address an illness, what I find profoundly empowering about addressing loneliness is that the ultimate solution to loneliness lies within each of us, is that we can be the medicine that each other needs. We can be the solution that other people crave. And it's one thing, in that sense, I think we're all doctors, we're all healers when it comes to addressing loneliness. And the question is, do we have the courage to speak up and to stand up for others, to reach out to them when we feel they may be in need? I was thinking about this story that was shared earlier, the example of the gentleman who was moderating the panel and said when his coffee or his tea spilled, that one person responded and the other didn't. There are moments like that that happen throughout our lives, throughout our days, right? Where we have small opportunities to respond when someone is in hardship, to smile when someone passes us on the road, to reach out, when we see another person. And those are all small moments of connection which collectively make a big difference. And that's why there are studies which have shown that even this simple act of making eye contact with someone, a total stranger who's walking down the road, actually does affect how connected you feel. So our friendships, our close friendships, are deeply important. But it is these small interactions we have with people in our looser networks, strangers, people in our workplace, that ultimately can make a big difference in how we feel. And that's why I think it's important that we start this effort to address loneliness by asking ourselves, what can we do in our own lives, in our own homes, in our own neighborhoods, to help make people feel connected? Even if we ourselves are feeling lonely, as we have heard earlier today and as we know from some of the data, the best way to feel less lonely is to help others feel less lonely. Is to actually get out of our own heads and into someone else's life. That can be one of the most powerful things we can do. We in the office, it's something I shared with Jenny a little earlier, but when I was a Surgeon General, we had a relatively small office, which was actually funny. People thought that we had billions of dollars to spend and like thousands of employees. We actually didn't. Like our core staff was about 20 people. And we didn't have much money at all, but we begged, borrowed, and stealed from everyone else, so we could do what we needed to do. But in our office, as collegial as we were, as much as we sought to operate like a family, we also at some point recognized that people weren't feeling as connected, as they needed to, that people were starting to feel estranged from each other. And so what we did is we actually designed, with the help of one of our colleagues, Ann Kim, who's here, and with Jessica Scruggs, who helped with the implementation of this, who was with us in office as well. But we actually designed a simple exercise that was called the Inside Scoop exercise. And what we did is, for 5 minutes, once a week, at our all-hands meeting, we gave the floor to someone. And we said, you have 5 minutes to show us pictures. Pictures of your choosing. They could be about your childhood. They could be about what you did last summer. They could be about what you hope to do in the future. They could be about your family. But you show us whatever pictures you want. Tell us about them in 5 minutes. And they did. And it was very simple, but what happened was really transformative during those 5 minutes, which is that people exposed a part of them that they valued. And in doing so, they allowed us to appreciate and to value it as well. They went from being technicians or people who had a skill set to being human beings who had parts of themselves that we could all relate to and understand in some way. And that really strengthened our bond with each other. That changed actually how we worked together. People were more participatory. The meetings were more participatory. More people raised their hand and actually spoke up because they felt acknowledged. People volunteered to help others more when they were having challenges in their work, even if it was outside their lane, because again, they felt more connected to other people. There's a temptation to think sometimes that complex problems require complex and expensive solutions. But I actually think that it is sometimes the simple things that we do that can have the most profound impact on our loneliness.
It's like talking about how we sort of expand our own humanity. Right now we can really recognize each other more. I was struck in that last panel about that quote, you're a girl, it's lucky you get to be fully human. How we do that for everybody. With kids we recognize it maybe a little bit more, but with adults we need to recognize it as much. We have a very complex set of emotions and histories and past, and we need to access a little bit more of that. I want to open it for the audience. We have 15 minutes, and I'm sure we have lots of questions, so wait for a microphone if you could. Maybe up there.
Hello. My name's Caris. I'm here today. I've done a one-woman comedy science music show about the neuroscience of love and loneliness. And I grew up in a religious household, but I'm not particularly religious. And when I was looking back and researching, to begin with, I was going down the route of neuroscience of love, but then I always came back to loneliness. And that's where I faced it, is when I wasn't feeling love. And for me, growing up in a religious community where there's always every Sunday that society, they all come together. And chapel is, Welsh chapels are quite chilled out, actually. And to not be connected because I don't believe in that really And I see that's such a religious decline happening. And how do we get those people back together again is essentially that I just wanted to how do you feel about that?
It's such a good question, and I was just talking earlier today with somebody about the decline in sort of in church going and the attendance of other religious sort of traditional congregations, whether it be in mosques or synagogues or temples. And I think I don't think that the solution is necessary to tell everyone to go to church, right? Because that may or may not be the right thing for them. But I think there are two things I would say. One is that I do think faith organizations have a very powerful role that they can choose to play in very consciously building community, and building community in a way that is unconditional. This is really important, because if you build a community but you tell people that you're valued, you're loved, but only if you believe X, only if you believe Y, only if you look like this, only if you sound like that, only if you love a certain type of person, that's conditional love. And we need faith communities to do even more than what they're already doing, which is a lot, to build communities of unconditional love. But the other thing is, I think we need a place and a culture for people who may not want to attend or be a part of a traditional faith community. And in that sense, we need a secular, ethical culture, if you will, that builds and supports love. When you were talking about neuroscience and love, what popped into my mind is that the opposite of loneliness is in fact love, more than anything else. And it is a perceived absence of love, I think, that contributes to that feeling of loneliness, which is why I think you can be around people and still feel lonely if you don't feel valued and loved by them.
I looked at the logo for the Bimora, so that it's a heart.
Yeah.
That, for me, it's the one thing to combat loneliness.
Another question? Gentleman in the back?
Hello, my name is Guy Roberts. I'm a board member of the campaign. There's a very interesting piece of research conducted by Professor Christina Victor, who looked at the longitudinal study of aging in the UK. And one of the things that she identified was that people who expected that old age would be a lonely time, when you looked at their situation 15, 20 years later when they're older people, they were very highly prevalent amongst those who are lonely. My question is whether you have any observations about how people's internal worlds can be part of their pathways into loneliness.
Can you say a little bit more about that? About what you mean by their internal world?
It's interesting. What I deduced from the piece of research I referred to is how people think about aging and their own situation. People can end up in a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. That's one dimension, but I am more widely interested about people's internal worlds, their thought processes, their emotional processes, and how that can contribute to loneliness, because I don't hear a lot about the pathways, people's personal pathways into loneliness, and loneliness is an emotional and psychological situation. So what is the process that leads people to end up feeling lonely?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And what I'm understanding from your question, what I'm getting is that I think there are ways in which we process emotions, all of us. And how we process those emotions, I think, does have a material impact on whether we tend to experience more loneliness or not. If I, for example, deal with adversity by blaming myself, taking a hit to my self-worth, withdrawing from other people, and actually lashing out at other people in anger and resentment, that will likely increase my risk of loneliness, versus if I have a healthier way to process my disappointment and my anger. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why programs that actually in schools, social and emotional learning programs, which help children to understand and recognize and process and regulate their emotions from an early age, are so important. There's a school I visited in Hamden, Connecticut, which has a program called the Ruler Program. Has anyone heard of the Ruler Program, R-U-L-E-R? So the Ruler Program was developed at Yale by the Yale, I believe it's the Emotional Intelligence Center, but by a gentleman named Mark Brackett. And what the program does is exactly what we were talking about. It helps children to understand and recognize and regulate their emotions. And I remember when I went to the Hamden School, I was with a small group of fourth graders. And I was witnessing, I had witnessed earlier in that day, how they had woven this sort of teaching about emotions into every class. It wasn't a separate class that you went to, but it was infused into history, into English, into all the subjects that they took. And these three fourth graders, I was to ask them how the program was going and how their day was. And I remember one snippet, they said to me, oh, it was pretty good. It was a little challenging in the beginning because Michelle, one of their classmates, came in and she was really angry and she was throwing things and she was yelling at people. But we figured that she probably had a hard morning at home. Maybe her parents had yelled at her. Maybe something bad had happened. So we just, listened to her and we still hugged her and we said, Michelle, we love you. Everything's going to be okay. And by the end of the class, she was fine. And then they just moved on to something else. But it struck me that in that short snippet of conversation, they demonstrated so many important skills of pausing before they reacted, of thinking with empathy about what somebody else may have been going through that may have been causing their reaction, of recognizing that they themselves were not actually the object of that person's anger or frustration, and hence they didn't need to feel bad about themselves either. And I found this to be true of all the children there. And I just kept thinking to myself that these children have a facility with emotions, speaking about them and managing them, that many adults don't have either. And so I do think that this is an important skill set that while most of us don't learn, we have to teach people. And I think schools are one of the most universal experiences that we have in society. And so while schools are always reticent, I think, to take on even more, or reluctant, I should say, to take on even more responsibility, I think we have to help schools figure out how we can bring this kind of education and training into schools at the youngest of ages. Because the truth is, it's not just helpful for preventing conflict. But in 2016, when I issued the first Surgeon General's report on substance use and addiction, I had included in that with our team an entire chapter that focused on prevention. And most people thought that the programs we profiled would be the kind of programs that went to schools and hit kids over the head and said, drugs are bad, drugs are bad, drugs are bad. But that's not what they did at all. In fact, what many of them did is they helped children to build emotional well-being skills. And they helped them figure out how to build healthy relationships and stay connected with other people. And it turns out that's an extraordinarily powerful source both for prevention as well as for treatment.
I'm horribly sad to say we are out of time. I do want to give you, I know you wanted a moment to maybe wrap up at the end and make a few final comments.
Sure, well, that went by really fast.
I know.
Well,
I'm trying to ignore his signs, but he keeps flashing his 1 minute sign. I mean, it's only cocktails afterwards. Can't we run a little bit over? No, we can't. Okay.
At least
all
he
right.
didn't throw anything at us, so we're grateful for that.
So there we have it.
Well, I just first want to say just a thank you to all of you. The fact that you're all here, and you've taken time out of your lives and away from your families to be here and to be a part of this conversation and to continue the work that you've been doing in your home countries is just incredibly inspiring to me. I deeply believe that this is one of the most important issues that we have to deal with. And I'm not calling it a public health issue because I think it's much more than that. This is a deeply foundational issue because at the end, this is about much more than ensuring that people are connected. It's about much more than preventing the loss of years of life. It's about much more than preventing heart disease and dementia and depression. This at a really deep level is about what kind of society we want to be. Are we the kind of society that believes that every life truly does in fact have value? Are we the kind of society that will stand up for and speak up for each other, not just when it's easy, but even when it's difficult? And ultimately, are we the kind of society that will refuse to be governed by fear, which is the disease that's infecting us right now, but that chooses instead to stand up and to join together and to build a society that is informed and inspired by love? That choice that we have between love and fear, which is a choice that we have in how we live our lives, and how we build our societies. But that choice is a fundamental choice that I think is facing our world right now. And I think it is the most important question that we have to ask ourselves. Because when we lead with fear, that's when we see anger and jealousy and insecurity guide and inform and drive our actions. And we see that in our personal lives, we see that in our government, we see that everywhere. But when we lead with love, when we are able to lead with generosity, with kindness and compassion, then things are very, very different. Then we actually do choose the policies that benefit all of us and not just some of us. Then we do choose to say the thing that's helpful and not hurtful, and we end up finding that people are there for us. But that is the fundamental choice that we're making. And what gives me hope that we can lead in a life of love and that we can build a society grounded in love is the fact that this is not a skill that we have to teach people that they don't have. We just have to remember something that we've known actually since we were born. There's a school in Connecticut, in a small town called Newtown, Connecticut. It's called Sandy Hook Elementary School. Some of you may know that name. It's a school that experienced a tragedy that no school should ever have to experience. In December of 2012, there was a mass shooting at that school that killed a number of elementary school children and teachers. It was that horrific incident that tore into the consciousness of America that pushed me and many others to speak up and to do more to address gun violence in our country, a problem that we still have, unfortunately, today. But there was a young boy who died at that school, whose father I met a few years afterward. The young boy's name was Daniel, and what his father told me is that he was just 6 years old, Daniel, but every time he would go to school, when he was on the playground or in the cafeteria, he would look around to see if there was another child who was alone. And if that child was alone, he would often go up to them and talk to them. Or he would just sit next to them and say nothing. And nobody taught Daniel to do this. Nobody told him it would help him make more friends and influence people. He did that because deep inside he knew that this is what human beings do. That at the end of the day, as much as we have a culture of individualism, that we are in our hearts and in our genes, that we are interdependent creatures, that we are people who need each other. And when I think about my kids, about my 2-year-old son and my 8-month-old daughter, I want them to behave in the way that Daniel behaved. I want them to lead with love in their life when they're children and when they're adults. But I also know that for them to do that, they need more than parents who are telling them that. They need to have schools that they're going to that support and recognize the importance of connection. They need to be able to exist in a society that values them not because of their title and the wealth that they have and their reputation, but because of fundamentally who they are, compassionate, empathic, kind human beings. That's the kind of society that I want for my children, that I want for your children. And the reason that I am grateful to all of you today is because I think that what we are doing collectively is about more than trying to set up a few programs or raise a siloed issue. We are building a movement around how to fundamentally strengthen the foundation of society. That foundation is built on connection. It's built on our relationships with each other. And if we cannot strengthen that, then everything else that we build on that, our institutions, our programs, everything else, will be on shaky ground. And it may crumble. So this movement that you are helping to build and lead and power is the movement of our times. It is what we need. It's what my kids need. It's what your kids need. It's what all of us need. And so I want to wish you the very best of luck in your work and to tell you that certainly from my end and our end, we will continue to do everything we can to make sure that the world knows that loneliness is an important issue, that connection must be a top priority, and to help advance the science and practice in this area. And if we do this together, then my hope is that we can live in a more connected world, the kind of world that all of us deserve, the kind of world certainly that future generations deserve. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.